It's amazing to be. I didn't realise so many people were going to be here, and I have to say, I know a lot of people in the room, and although you're very nice individually, you're actually very intimidating. So I don't know if Darren's here. I think he's maybe just coming a little bit later. So I was asked to speak about ACEs, but having read Poverty Safari, which is a brilliant book, by the way, would recommend that you read it. I wanted just to go a little bit beyond that, and so I put extra words into the title here, and I think this is really, from my point of view, it's about respect and understanding, and I was hoping that would then align a little bit with what, I don't know what he's going to say, but the kind of things he will be coming to later on. Can I just check, so I put ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. How many people have some understanding or awareness of ACEs? So, okay. Stephen thought maybe about half, that looks about maybe 2/3, something like that. Okay. So what I thought I'd better do is just to make sure we're all on the same page, just make sure we all know what ACEs are, and then talk through the implications of that. Before I do so, it's a shame Darren's not in the room, because I wanted to begin with a quote from his book. So I don't know if you've read it, but it says in Scotland, the poverty industry is dominated by a left-leaning liberal middle class. So because this specialist class is so genuinely well-intentioned when it comes to interested people in deprived communities, they get a bit confused, upset and offended when those very people begin expressing anger towards them. It never occurs to them because they see themselves as the good guys, which I think is really important. The people they aim to serve may in fact perceive them as chancers, careerists or charlatans. So, ouch, that's okay. I'm certainly one of those people. But actually, I don't agree with all of it, but I agree with the thrust of what he's saying, actually. And I wanted to take where we're going with ACEs and sort of bring it alongside with that, because although that's quite a bold thing to say, we're maybe not as far apart on the views as you might think. Hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss later on. So I thought this is about relating and respect and validation, so I just want to do a little bit about how are we actually connecting, what's the language you use, how do we make sense of each other. To do a bit on ACEs, I know it sounds like a stupid question because ACEs are about trauma and abuse and adversity, but just to ask the question, what is it about that in particular that is so painful and so harmful long term? To put ACEs in a broader context of capabilities and then just think about what we can do. So actually that is loads to cover, and I don't have a watch, so I'm just going to kind of keep me right in terms of time. Okay. And a lot of this is to do with psychiatry, so psychiatry likes to think of itself as very, not just clever, actually brainy, because we spend a lot of time looking at brains or thinking about brains. But as everybody knows, the risk is if you do that, you kind of forget the person. And we focus on neurobiology and neuroscience and all the rest of it, and we become a bit mindless because we've forgotten about people. So what I want to talk about, I think the brain stuff is important. Actually, I really am quite nerdy and quite interested in all the science of that. But there's a huge risk that we don't do the bit on the other side. That's what particularly matters to people. And you see it come out, so lots of people here will know Simon Bradstreet, who used to head up the Scottish Recovery Network. He tweeted with colleagues recently, one of the big journals in psychiatry is the Lancet Psychiatry, and they used a really unfortunate phrase in a recent edition. So it said, you probably can't read it. In the journal article, they said, schizophrenia patients fail to remit to a single antipsychotic. So this is the kind of language that doctors use all the time. They don't even notice, or it's just like breathing, aren't aware of it. And they were called out quite rightly to say, we would ask the psychiatric community to consider what's being communicated. Is it the patient's failure, which is what it says, or is it a failure of treatment, i.e. a care failure? So I thought this was great. It's the first time I've seen this. This is good for this kind of thing, to call out a kind of shift in perspective. And when you see it once, you see it all the time. So I've been at a meeting, actually a scientific conference last week, and you hear treatment resistance quite a lot. As if like the patient was suddenly fighting back against a successful treatment. And another one, somebody called me out on this. I just, in talking normally, I talked about an intervention. And somebody with family experience just put their hand up and said, can I just check who's intervening and who asked you to? And on whose behalf are you doing these things? And did you involve them in those decisions? And I have to say that was I hadn't realised that said intervention, but it was a really useful correction. Dysfunction was another word the same person called out to somebody else. And at this meeting, I have to say that we're mainly Germans who were doing this, but they're presenting lots of very scientific brain scans and EEGs and all this kind of stuff. But they had a terrible habit of talking about patients who were the subjects of the research and controls, but they didn't say controls, they said healthies, which I just found really bizarre. The speaker after speaker said the same thing. It's just, I'm just saying there's a bit of a disconnect, which you hear in the language. And the one applies not just to mental health, but across the whole field. If you're ever in a meeting and you hear somebody inadvertently talk about these people, then I think you need to just, I think it's a big flag of something's gone wrong in our communication. And I'm saying that as someone who's accidentally used those words myself. So I'm kind of drilling that into my brain that if you start talking about these people, you probably come a little bit adrift. Okay, so that's the thing, I guess, I think Darren's sort of in that space about, have we got two separate tribes of people who think they're there to help, or the professionals think they're there to help, but actually keep on giving themselves away, not really understanding where the other people are actually coming from. Right, ACEs. So I know lots of people know about this, but ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. There was a list of 10 bad things that can happen to you up to the age of 18, and this was researched in California in the late 90s. These are the 10. So physical, verbal or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and then what they called household adversities. Actually, this is a Scottish slide, and we changed it because the original American one said household dysfunction, and we thought that was a kind of blaming way of putting it, so we changed it to say adversities faced by the household. In the original study, it was mental illness, somebody in prison, domestic violence, parents split up, or substance misuse. So, I mean, obviously, those are all potentially harmful things. And in America, and also around the world, and in the UK, ACEs are really common. So, about half of people in the UK have at least one adverse childhood experience, one ACE. And about 8%, what's it, 1 in 7, no, sorry, 1 in 12 or something, have got 4 or more. And just to say, ACEs are not things that happen to other people. I've done this actually in these things, we won't do it today. But you can say with some confidence that the average ACE score here in this room will be much higher than the general population. So when we're thinking about ACEs, we are actually thinking about ourselves in this room. And just in that context, ACEs are potentially, they're common, but potentially very harmful. So lifetime smoking would reduce your life expectancy maybe by 10 or 12 years. If you've got 6 or more ACEs, on average, the risk is that your lifespan would also be reduced by 20 years. I'm not saying that to scare people or to be pessimistic, but I'm saying it to say this is a big effect, this is a really important thing, and I'll speak a bit later on about how we might be able to overcome it. So, for those who don't know, if you have these adverse childhood experiences in childhood, after 18, you're more likely to run into problems in adulthood. 4 times more likely to get depressed. A huge increase in the risk of sexually transmitted infection, which I think is because ACEs are really about relationships, and of course, your sexual behaviour is also about relationships. A big increase in unemployment, a big increase for women of being a mum under the age of 18, also for guys of being a dad under the age of 18, and a hugely increased risk of either hitting somebody or being hit by somebody in the last month. Maybe not surprisingly, leading to a big risk of increased risk of going to A&E and a big risk of suicide. So most people are aware of those kind of statistics, I guess. Just to say, although ACEs and poverty overlap, they are separate. So with lots of people living in very deprived situations who don't have any ACEs at all, and certainly lots of people in very affluent situations who've got loads of ACEs. So they overlap, but they're not the same thing, which I think is really important. And also, so the original study was done in California 20 years ago, and it was just really about things that might have happened in the household, but all the work that's happened since, and there's thousands of papers, I've been looking at, well actually it's not just the household, you've got adverse childhood experiences, ACE, you've also got adverse community experiences, ACE, and I won't go through them all, we're still working out in the research which are most important. There's loads of papers, and the kinds of things that come through are multiple and traumatic bereavements, should be an ACE, bullying should be an ACE, discrimination, racism would be an ACE, witnessing violence, not feeling safe, not having enough food, being poor, being home, all the things that you would expect. So although the original study was done in 10 relatively limited lists, when you actually look further, there's lots of other things that are ACEs. Okay, so that's all. I mean, it's important to say it so that we recognise how important ACEs are, but I don't want to get people feeling pessimistic or helpless about it. So this is maybe the most important slide of all. So in all the thousands of studies, actually I haven't seen a single one that didn't show the more ACEs you have, the more problems you get. They all show the same pattern. So what was really encouraging was that some research came out a couple of years ago from England, actually in Wales, which was looking not just about how many ACEs have you got, how much adversity were you exposed to, but also to think about what about the more positive side. So they looked at what they called an always available adult. So as you were growing up, it doesn't matter who it was, it could be a teacher, a granny, an auntie, your brother, your big sister, your parents. If there was always somebody there who would take your side, who would listen to what you said, who would look out for you, look what happens to the ACE score. It goes down by 3 times. So although if you had, let's say, 6 ACEs, you might be at quite a high risk up here. If there was always an adult available to support you, your risk plummets right down. So my reading of that is, first of all, the harm of ACEs is not inevitable. And the second one is, this is all about relationships. So whatever it is, you think about this huge range of things that can potentially adversely affect your health, and unemployment and relationships and all kinds of other things I haven't even mentioned. What is it they have in common? I think it's something to do with relationship. And again, there's lots of really interesting work on this. And I'll just show this is what this is. These are somebody's drawn these pictures. Somebody sat through hours and hours of video and transcribed video into these pictures. So this is an experiment. This is a research design. Okay, so what they do is they get a mum and they get their baby who's under a year old, and they put one camera on the baby in the cot and another camera on the mum, so that the researchers can see what they're all doing. And they just let the cameras roll, and then they transcribe afterwards what happens, not just second by second, but actually twice a second. And these videos can't just be released, so in order to publish them semi-anonymously, I don't know how they did this, but somebody actually drew all the frames of the video. These are half second by half second. So this is a secure attachment. This is a really positive link between mother and baby. And you can see the baby's really happy and the mum's really happy. And then the baby just kind of puts its arms back. And the mum's just kind of checking. She leans in thinking, I'm just going to check on you. Actually, the baby doesn't like that. The baby goes even further back. It looks a bit upset. She responds. She just backs off a bit to give the baby a bit of space. And the baby's still not happy. He's sort of biting his bottom lip. And she does the same. So everybody who is a parent who has got child care responsibilities knows how exhausting parenting is. And this is the reason. Because we are constantly responding and interacting and checking in with children. And it doesn't stop with infants, as we know, whether you've got toddlers or older children or teenagers. There's still this process of child's very happy, scoots off far enough away, having adventures to actually run into trouble or get a bit worried, and then they have to come back, they get comforted, they wail, and they're off again. And that's how we learn. That's just part of, that's how we kind of develop as people. And it's really easy to imagine how ACEs would actually impair all this whole process. So if your mum's depressed, she can't do that. If she's had a drink, she's not going to do that particularly well. Or even, if she's in prison or somewhere else, she's not even there to help you. So it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to see just how quickly adverse childhood experiences will impede all this stuff. And I think that's probably what makes ACEs so harmful. What do I do for time? So what I want to do is just share. But we've done a lot of work. We've done some research work. We've done a lot of campaigning. We've been lobbied the government. So last year, Nicola Sturgeon put ACEs prevention into the programme for government. This year, they've invested, so they've got a department, so they've got civil servants now working on ACEs full-time. There's a small team of people. The programme for government is even bigger this year. There was a huge conference just 2 weeks ago in Glasgow about ACEs. So ACEs is really moving ahead as something I think we can hopefully take action on. But the worry for me is, well, it's not new. I mean, it's not that we didn't realise that a parent in prison was bad for you, or that physical abuse could be harmful. We need to think a little bit around what is new about ACEs that would let us do things a bit differently. So in this context, I was kind of interested by this woman, Martha Nussbaum, is a philosopher actually. She came up with this idea of most people haven't heard of this actually, capabilities. Does anybody know hands going up this time? So she's not a clinician, she's not a social scientist, she's a philosopher. So she was just thinking about what is it that people need to live well. So it's a theory of social justice based on ideas about dignity, not the kind of language we usually use in clinical settings. So she asked the question, what are people actually able to do and to be? And what real opportunities are open to people? And the point of this was, what she was trying to do was to work out what's the basic minimum that everybody needs to be able to do in order to live a full life. So I read this and thought, oh, that's interesting. Because actually she's got 10 capabilities, and we've got 10 ACEs. And I was thinking, well, we've got 10 negative things on the one side, and we've got 10 positive things on the other. How do those kind of fit together? So actually it's a good book. It's not a difficult book to read. I would recommend it if you're interested. But I'll just briefly summarise what it was. So remember the 10 ACEs we had before? These are the 10 capabilities. The first one I always find kind of odd. I think it's maybe because, like, life you would have thought would be a basic capability, like not actually being alive. But then she's a philosopher, so I guess that's the way she goes. But so there's life, health, in fact, I'll just go through these one by one. So there's 10 basic things. What she does is not to say the more of this, the better. What she says, unless you reach a minimum level on all of these, you can't really be fulfilled in your life. Okay? So just to give you a sense, a bit more detail about some of them. So this is the one that's most connected to ACEs. So the bodily integrity, it means safety, really. So she says to be secure against violent assault, including sexual assault and domestic violence. So ACEs will directly impede that potential, that capability. What else have we got? I like this one. This is about emotions. So as a psychiatrist, working in Renfrewshire for a long time, a lot of people would come to you with emotional problems which we were trying to fix. And psychiatrists can be a bit bad sometimes about trying to take away all the negatives. What I liked about this was to be able to love, but also to be able to grieve. So that's a normal feeling to have. Displays longing, gratitude, and also justified anger. And again, with lots of anger management, around the place and in the NHS, that's not always appropriate. Sometimes people should be angry. So I just noticed this as a psychiatrist. I quite like the framing of this because it was not trying to get everybody into a standard set of feelings. This was interesting. So she calls it practical reason, which I might have just said education. But what she means by education is not just your usual ABCs and all the rest of it. But she emphasises science. And what she means is, by science, she doesn't mean test tubes and stuff. She means the skill to be able to take in evidence, think about what it means, analyse it, and then take some action. So she's really talking about problem solving. And she says, unless you're able to do that in your life, to question what's presented to you and make your own decisions, you can't really live fully. So I like that one as well. And again, the more I think about this, the more important I think this one is. So the right to political expression, participation, and choices. And this goes back to what that original slide that Darren was using. I'll show one more. This is being able to live with other people, which seems obvious. To engage in various forms of social interaction, well, yeah, that is important, obviously, to join groups and clubs and activities and mingle with other people. I've just emphasised this one, to be able to imagine the situation of another. Because I think that's going back to the first slides I showed about Darren's critique of professionals meaning well, but actually not really getting people's situation. And then that's showing up on those quotes I gave. So some of the language that we tend to use gives away the fact that we're not really tuned into what people want. So at the risk of bringing in more jargon into this thing of being able to imagine the situation of another, okay, before I get to that. So if you just assume that we're all alive and therefore the life is the capability that's taken care of for the moment, there's 9 left. I think of those like as a jigsaw pieces, and what she says is all of those have to be in place to live well. And like I said before, ACEs start to take the bits out of the jigsaw. So that's the way I'm kind of thinking about, this is the importance of ACEs. It's not a mental health thing, it's not a social work thing, it's actually something much bigger. It's a civic thing, in a way, because it includes choice and voice, and affiliation, and representation, and actually getting angry and pushing up your voice when things are correct. So, the conference I was at last week was about borderline personality disorder, which people will know about, which, that's not that's a whole topic in its own way, but it was really interesting because that was kind of in the same space. And what people were talking about a lot was the extent to which people with borderline and people trying to help people with borderline often misunderstand each other. And those misunderstandings are really painful. In fact, they're unbearable if you've had a lot of that experience previously in your life. So, one of the ways to talk about there's a jargon, it's called mentalizing. So there's a whole approach which is saying that misunderstanding is, I hate this word, is a failure to mentalize. But what mentalize means is the idea that all of us are difficult to read for other people. Right? We're always trying to work out what everybody else is saying, but we almost always get it wrong. And I like that idea. So there's constant effort to understand what other people are thinking. Here's an example. So they call this a mentalizing failure, so mentalizing the ability to connect or understand what other people are saying. And I like this story. It's kind of against doctors. A mother was watching her 5-year-old daughter play. The child had taken a stethoscope out of her mother's doctor's bag and was playing with it. As she put the stethoscope to her ears, her mother thought proudly, she seems interested in medicine. Maybe she'll grow up and become a doctor like me. After a time, the little girl put the listening end of the stethoscope to her mouth and said, "Welcome to McDonald's." So we do this all the time, and we're always getting it wrong, and usually it's really quite funny. And actually, this is too complicated a slide, but if you Google Wikipedia, you look at I'm not a psychologist, but if you look at cognitive biases, there's this amazing diagram on Wikipedia which shows you cognitive biases are all the ways that our brain gets stuff wrong again and again and again. So they say that we don't remember things correctly, we don't process information properly, we don't get the right meaning out of things, and when we need to act fast, we make lots of particular mistakes. So that's definitely true, I think, of all of us. And mentalizing is just tuning into the way in which we keep on making mistakes. So mentalizing means there's lots of ways of defining it. These are a few. Holding mind in mind, quite technical. Thinking about the mental states in yourself and others. Understanding misunderstandings. And this is maybe the best one, which is seeing yourself from the outside, but others from the inside. And I think this is at the core of the kind of challenge we've got, not just as people in the community or as people with mental health problems, but also as services to try and do this a bit better. And you'll be surprised to hear, okay, so that involves contemplating, reflection, taking other people's views, being interested, being allowed to be sceptical. Somebody says something you don't think is probably right, forgiving people if they make a mistake and actually own up to it, trying to be predictable, and actually just accepting, well, we don't always know the answer. So those would be good qualities to have, I think, as people, also as services, and services do this really badly. So I think services really struggle to manage to deliver that. And I'm not here to bash me or my colleagues. I think the reason is nobody can do that. You know, nobody can have the degree of insight and responsiveness and flexibility that you would see in a securely attached mum and her infant. But actually, to do it well, that's how good you have to be. So examples of not mentalizing, so getting it wrong, would include, so this was a list which I've taken from a textbook about mentalizing with people with borderline personality disorder. Okay, it's actually a good book, I'm not criticising the book. And what it's telling therapists is, watch out for when your patient is doing this kind of thing, because it's a sign you've lost your connection. You need to work really hard to bring both of you back together again. So if someone is using lots of excessive detail, too much thoughts and fillers, they're focusing all the time on stuff that's outside and not actually about them or things that are in the room. If they're labelling people very readily and not thinking about them as individuals, or physical characteristics or stereotypes. They're always telling you what people should have done or shouldn't have done, or how they've broken the rules. It's just that they're not part of this issue that they're complaining about, and are really certain about other people's thoughts and feelings. Those are signs of not mentalising. And it was written so that clinicians could identify it and then reconnect the patients, because we can't afford to lose that connection if you're trying to be therapeutic. But as I look at that now, if I were a patient, I'd be going, yeah, I think the NHS does that quite a lot. If you recognise these things, too much detail. I mean, how many letters and information leaflets and bits and pieces, text messages, are focused on labels, so a diagnostically driven system, a focus on things that people should and shouldn't do. You must phone to confirm your appointment. If you don't do that, then you cancel the day in, it will take you away. And being really certain about people's thoughts and feelings. So I like the whole thing of mentalising, not just because actually it is a helpful way to properly connect with service users, people seeking our help. It's also quite a big critique or a pointer to the kinds of areas where we might get things wrong as well. So here's a slide that kind of summarises that a lot. This was from a cartoonist in New Zealand. It's nothing to do with ACEs or mental health or anything else, but it actually gets to the point. So there's this, the main thing is you've got this big pinstriped, presumably male finger pointing at the infant going, you're going to make a lot of bad choices in your life. You're going to choose the wrong parents, the wrong socioeconomic group, or the wrong social welfare home, where you're going to get yourself abused. And after that, you're just going to carry on making bad choices until you end up in prison or a psych ward. When are you going to take some responsibility for yourself? And yeah, there's a sort of wry chuckle because it is a bit ridiculous, but equally it's awful. You know, you're sort of caught between the two extremes. And the reason I find this a bit, it is funny, but also a bit challenging, is it's funny because nobody would ever do that to an infant. You'd never do it to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. But a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 20-year-old, absolutely we would do that. And it's just this finger, this keeps reappearing, this long pinstripe arm pointing comes into my head quite a lot. So when having seen it in the cartoon, you start noticing the hand come out quite a lot. Not just at work, actually as a parent, you know, I think, just put that back. Because it's very easy to blame somebody else for everything that's happening and not take your share of that responsibility. I missed out a slide. So the conclusion, so what this sleeve and this hand represents is something you get all the time with ACEs, which is blame, shame and punishment. And that's horrible to be on the receiving end of it. So what we're trying to do with the ACEs thing is to move away from obviously blame, shame and punishment. And the phrase that captures that really well, I think, is to go, not, you know, what's wrong with you, but to go, what happened to you? You know, tell me about it, let me understand it. And I think for services, we're trying to, so it's not blame, shame and punishment we should be doing, it's acceptance. Whatever this thing or this behaviour or this problem is, we'll just accept that it's there. We won't assume that it's your fault. We'll be curious about it with you, and then we'll engage with you to kind of do something about it. So that's quite a big shift actually for services. So go back to Darren's, I don't know if you can see it, but I quoted this slide in the beginning. It's this thing about well-intentioned professionals. So I think we are well-intentioned, but that doesn't mean we don't get it wrong. And I think before this kind of ACE awareness or mentalising awareness, it's like, I know what's best for my patients. And my personal needs and preferences don't have anything to do with my professional behaviour. So my professional character is unrelated to everything else that's kind of relevant to my life. Whereas actually, in the ACE-informed world, it's not what you want for your patients. The patients need to be enabled to have choice and voice, informed by your opinion and the dialogue. And equally, none of us can kind of firewall our personal stuff and stop it from coming into your work. So the challenge then is just to include others in the discussions in a trustworthy way. I'm going to finish a bit early, so there'll be a bit of time for discussion. I don't know if it's hard to read the room, there's so many people here, it's getting quite hot, but I think sometimes this goes down really well, sometimes people just don't buy it at all, so it just doesn't seem relevant or seems a bit obscure or a bit strange. But actually, I think this is very real, and very practical. It's just different from our usual way of thinking. So if you look around Glasgow and Clyde, there are a lot of services that have actually started doing this. So for example, the Violence Reduction Unit took this approach. So the police were the leaders in this. They learned about ACEs in the early 2000s, made major changes, and we've seen a dramatic reduction in violence in Glasgow as a consequence. They stopped blaming the young people. They started to move around beside them and started to discuss with them what was happening. In nurture schools in Glasgow, they've changed the approach from kind of blaming the disruptive children and excluding them from school, but actually changing the school environment so that their distress and feelings can be contained. I've been really impressed. It's the Glasgow Association for Mental Health, but they've got the Young Carers Project, where the young people there have done amazing work in supporting each other through really severe adversity because of their parental difficulties. And I could go on and on and on with loads and loads of examples. I'll say one more, which is the recovery community in addiction services in Glasgow, which is now service user led. It's actually much more effective, much more welcome than it used to be, and it actually costs less money. So there's something here. This isn't soft, this isn't pie in the sky. This is really pragmatic, useful stuff that we should be implementing, but we actually find it quite difficult to do. I was just looking at some evidence recently. Simon Bradstreet put me onto this paper. So it was looking at 20 years of research into recovery, and they're looking at which recovery services work well, which ones didn't work so well. And it was pretty clear of all the thousands of different variables that there were. The ones that were appreciated by people who supported recovery, the word was humanising, and the words where people didn't feel supported, the word was abandoned. And that was the conclusion of 20 years of research. So I mean, we can't keep on ignoring this. We have to actually seriously, respond. That's strange. We need to start responding to it. So we'll stop in a minute and get some questions. There's a slide here I liked. It took me a couple of minutes to kind of work out what this was, but it's not, I'll see it when I believe it. No, hold on, I've got that wrong. It's not I'll believe it when I see it, which is actually kind of non-mentalizing. It's the other way around. Like, when I get this way of thinking, then I'm going to see it everywhere. And actually, that's what started to happen to me, is that I'll see it when I believe it. So just to sum up, ACEs are really powerful, similar to smoking in the strength of their effect. The connected to poverty but not the same. ACE-informed practice and policy can be really effective. ACE responsive services really need to change. I think most of that is about the relational aspects of care. So it's the staff, primarily, who need to make the change. And actually, it's something around being dismissed or invalidated or overlooked is far more painful and hurtful than we've recognised. And when I look at the complaints that come through from our system, we get a fair number of complaints. There's a report done every month. It's very unusual for people to complain, I didn't get treatment X, or this was whatever it was. It's almost always the receptionist didn't stop talking on the phone when I went to the front window, or nobody said sorry, or I felt, brushed aside. So we have a systemic problem, I think, in the NHS and other big organisations with doing this kind of relational stuff a bit better. And finally, there was a Twitter meme that I really like, which is this one: everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. That's a mentalising statement, I think. Be kind. And I was really pleased to find this is not a Californian Twitter, Facebook, Instagram meme. It was actually written by a Scottish reverend more than 100 years ago. That was the name, Ian Clark. So I think that kind of summarised quite a lot of what we've been talking about, and I hope that links into what Darren's going to say later on. Thank you very much.